I guess I shouldn't be surprised at how addicted I became to Slay the Spire. Single player card games are a huge passion of mine, so combining one with an infinitely replayable roguelike formula was a good idea. And hey, that's not even my subjective opinion. Clearly I'm not the only one who thinks so if the dozens of copycat games that came out in the months that followed Slay the Spire's original release are anything to go by. Now that the game has more formally been finished with multiple console releases on top of saying farewell to the early access program, I think it's finally time I share my thoughts. 96. That is the amount of hours I spent slaying the Spire, most of which happened in the past month. That is exactly 4 whole days, and frankly the only reason I stopped was that I needed to get this video out at some point. So what exactly is Slay the Spire, and why was I so addicted? Well, first off, it's worth noting that Slay the Spire isn't a card game in the traditional sense. Unlike something like Magic the Gathering or Hearthstone, where you build your decks out of an immense library of options ahead of time, Slay the Spire is what fans would call a deck building game. The building of your deck is something that happens while you play the game, not prior to playing the game. At the end of every combat encounter, you get presented with a choice of 3 cards to add to your originally very basic deck. By the end of your 1 to 2 hour run, you will have been through dozens of encounters and made a deck that is unique to that specific run. No 2 runs will give you the exact same options, so you will never end up with the same exact deck, and that uniqueness is the big reason why it's so easy to get sucked into a subsequent playthrough. The randomness of the cards you encounter also has the added benefit of forcing the player to be adaptive during play. You may go into a run with a vague outline of the style of deck you want to make and trend towards that particular direction, but if you don't play around the random variables that interfere in your game and adapt, you'll never be a great player. What's great about that statement is that that's something that you can say both about deck building games and roguelike games. They're both genres that rely on small sessions that you play over and over again, with randomness to keep each run feeling fresh and different. And I think this overlap in strength within the 2 genres amplifies the fun to be had here. The Spire itself is composed of 3 different sections, with a 4th secret section to unlock later on. Each of the sections has a dozen or so semi-randomized floors to climb. Each of these floors could either be a random event that plays out like a little choose-your-own-adventure game, a shop where you can purchase new cards or equipment, and the most common of the 3, which is a combat scenario. The combat plays out in a turn-based fashion. You draw 5 cards from your deck at the start of each turn. Limited energy prevents you from playing every single card you want, so after choosing which you want to play, your turn ends, your hand gets discarded, your opponent attacks you, and then you repeat the process. Once you draw through your entire deck, your discard pile gets shuffled back into your deck. If you're experienced with card or deck building games, the way that this plays out may jump out at you to focus on some key strategies, namely, that of building a small deck. Like mentioned before, you get the ability to pick from 3 different cards at the end of each combat encounter, but the often overlooked 4th choice is to skip picking up one of these 3 cards altogether. The benefit to this is that you get to keep your overall deck size small and thus more reliable. It's much better to have a deck of 10 to 15 really strong cards than a deck of 25 to 30 really strong cards. Reason being is that the small deck is more predictable and reliable. One of my first successful runs involved me managing to worm my way down to an 8-card deck, using some special items and deck thinning options at the merchant. This meant that I was extremely likely to draw all of the necessary tools I needed both to attack and defend myself each turn, whereas if I had twice as many cards, I wouldn't be quite as sure what my next turn would look like. It's incredible that taking away options is just as much of a viable and engaging strategy as gaining them is here in Slay the Spire. The beginning of each run opens up with you selecting one of the game's 3 classes: the warrior-like Ironclad, the rogue-like Silent, and the mage-like Defect. Each of these classes has a different pool of random cards that they could potentially build from, as well as one unique starting card and a starting relic, which gives them some sort of passive bonus during combat. You will certainly find your favorite among the bunch relatively early on. My personal favorite was the Ironclad, whose starting relic healed him for a small amount at the end of each combat encounter. This allows you to play more aggressively and trade some of your early game hit points for potentially great reward, causing me to more riskily dive into combat encounters with the hopes of strong rare cards or rare relics. On the other end of the spectrum, the Silent focuses on extreme card draw and setting up future turns. She can't heal after every combat like the Ironclad does, so every point of damage you receive will stick. It's a playstyle that will force you to look at the big picture and attempt to line up strong combos that will decisively end your opponents, all while making sure you don't take too much of a beating while navigating your way to that special turn. And finally, the Defect, who specializes in card generation and powerful end-of-turn effects. The Defect has multiple orbs channeling above his head at any given time, each with its own unique benefit. One of my best runs involved stockpiling some post-turn damage effects on top of my ability to stall out the game, guaranteeing that lots of turns had passed and, consequently, lots of damage was dealt. I guess that leads me into one of my only real wants out of the game, that is, well, I just wish there was even more. Maybe one extra class, or maybe slightly more diversity between runs as far as the actual floors themselves go. The 3 different floors you climb are identical, even though some of the minutiae changes each run. Broadly speaking, you'll go through the same types of enemies and the same level themes, even though the order in which you face them and which boss you fight will differ. It's hardly a big complaint as much as it is a small want. I'm really looking forward to whatever the developer, Megacrit Games, does next with a presumably much bigger budget on their next game. Slay the Spire's interface is incredibly easy to use. Depending on your platform of choice, you can either click or drag cards from your hand outward to activate their effects. Why this ended up being such a big deal to me is actually something that may surprise you. A majority of my 96 hours was spent on my cell phone using Steam's relatively new Steam Link app. With it, you can stream your desktop to your phone and use a variety of input methods to actually play the game, including a simple touch interface. This means that I could pull out my phone at any time to start playing Slay the Spire, and despite some UI elements being a little too small for the screen size, the smoothness of the experience would make you think this was a proper mobile game you'd have downloaded from the App Store. The game is easily played with one hand, and the animations are snappy and quick. Combine that with the fact that Slay the Spire's turn-based run approach made it my phone game of choice for lunch breaks or lying in bed. It's hard to say if that's more of a compliment towards Slay the Spire or Steam's streaming technology. It's probably a bit of both, but if you have the Steam version, I would recommend giving the Steam Link app a shot. This game is a really great showcase for it. Slay the Spire became a full-time job for me, both in terms of the ludicrous amount of hours I spent on it in a relatively short amount of time, and how invested and challenged I was during each of those hours. Its presentation leaves a lot to be desired, but that's one of the only real flaws I can level up my time spent here. For a first game out of the studio, Slay the Spire nails what's really important. It's an easy-to-learn, hard-to-master, well-balanced blend of 2 genres that should have been put together a long time ago.